Do you also put rubber bands around your penis till it turns blue?
A cock ring is basically a rubber band, right?
Thanks, Raj.
And thank you, Kevin, for your email. Welcome back to Shat on TV Watchmen, the unofficial podcast companion piece to the hit HBO series Watchmen. I'm one of your hosts, Gene Lyons, and alongside me are my two co-hosts, the King Bee.
Hello, friends.
And Roger Roper.
It's extremely difficult to be a white man in America right now, so I might try to be a blue one.
And this is our bonus newsstand edition, where we look back at the top listener emails and voicemails for the week. In this edition, we'll be covering mostly episodes 6 and 7 of The Watchmen, with some projections going forward into the final episodes 8 and 9. And we've got a ton of emails to read through and more voicemails than ever this week. So I'm really excited about those, getting to hear listeners in their own voices. Guys, I don't know if you've seen what I've seen in feedback coming in from the listeners, but people were not too excited about our deep dive.
You know, it's strange that they weren't that excited because I listened to it on my way back from Florida on my 4.5 hour jaunt back from Daytona Beach. And I thought you guys did a masterful job. I thought you guys did a great job, even though you had problems with the episode. I don't think it was very critical. I think you guys went and examined it with an open eye and clear hearts. And I don't see why there would be any hate for the deep dive, especially the King Bee. I thought like you would shit all over it, but even the King Bee was good.
I got that shit in my heart. The more I do these things, the more I try to temper my words. You know, I try to do everything 110%. So I do try to like tame it a little bit for the show. And then I usually, as soon as the microphone turns off, I stomp away and go, it's all bullshit.
Well, that's a perfect segue into our first email that we get. And we're going to start with some emails telling us what we got wrong. And the first one comes from Leonka Lyons. And she says, first, I want to marry King Bee. You're such a curmudgeon, and I feel like you just need a really good hug and to be spooned. Secondly, you guys are super jaded in your perspective of this episode. This was your least favorite and my favorite. All of my friends that watched it were completely mind blown from this episode. Some of the stuff that was super obvious to you guys was not to us, like Looking Glass infiltrating the 7th Cavalry. I was like, oh shit, definitely didn't catch that. I'm not a comic book head and I didn't see the movie or read the book. I basically rely on you guys heavily for explanation of this series. It makes me feel a certain kind of way when you're like, that was super obvious. And I'm like, not to me. I don't want you to necessarily change because I'm kind of obsessed with you guys the way you are. But keep in mind, there are some of us folk that aren't as smart as y'all. Don't rub it in our face. Laughing my ass off. Next, I was going to suggest that the Watchtower is a ginormous mesmerism tower to tell the 7th Cavalry to chill the fuck out. But you saw that too. I also feel like because Lady Trieu has such high esteem for Ozymandias that she will kill people to save humanity. Also, that is her daddy. Finally, the meteor that landed here from Earth on the Clark land, now Lady Trieu's, okay, it's not literally Superman, but maybe it's a Superman-like being that could have been the Clark's but is now Lady Trieu's. Why? I have no effing idea. But there are too many odes to Superman in this series, so why not? The alternative is that it is Ozymandias, Lady Trieu's daddy. More likely, huh? And maybe the ode to Superman is how he arrives? The question is he coming in as a baby, like Bien, or as old man Veidt? If it's a baby, then would she raise her mother and father as her children and as brother and sister? Holy shit, that's weird, but so are baby swamps and psychic squid alien invasions. It is what it is. Okay, bye. Love y'all. Leonka Lyons. Gene, are we related? P.S. By the way, I wrote y'all and a lot of this in my own black girl magic voice just to hear Gene possibly read it on air in his journalist voice. Ha 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 ha.
Lianka, thanks so much for writing in. I am open to marriage proposals. I will hold you like no other. I will attend only 1 in 3 of every event that you attempt to drag me to. So that's just putting my terms on the table to start with. I did a little bit of research. Did you know, guys, that comic books have been around longer than radio? And to me, it's just a storytelling medium that I'm really intimately familiar with. I've kind of watched it grow and change. And so when I look at these things with a critical eye, and I'm not surprised when this guy shows up or that event takes place, it's just because like I understand how a lot of these types of stories are told or meant to be told. And remember, Watchmen was just an analog for other types of existing superheroes. Dr. Manhattan is sort of the Superman for their time and place. So you're not wrong in how you see or when you see these sort of allusions to things that came before.
I got to give Lianka credit here, though, in that I didn't put 2 and 2 together when you guys mentioned on the deep dive that you believe the Watchtower is a mesmerism device that Lady Trieu will use. So I, like Lianka, I didn't catch that, but I did catch when you guys were talking about the elephant. I think in the Peteypedia, Lady Trieu has developed some of that teleportation capabilities that we saw the 7th Cavalry using. And so perhaps she used that same technology to get the elephant in the room, because you were kind of questioning, where's the garage door? How are they getting the elephant into that? So I think maybe that was it. That was the one thing that I picked up in. And I've been rereading the comic book, the original graphic novel, The Watchmen, the 12-part series, as I go to sleep every night. All the connections to Superman actually did exist in the graphic novel. The other stuff, I don't believe Ozymandias is coming back as a baby like BN. I don't think that he's going to be raised as brother and sister.
Thanks, Lianka, for your email, and I hope I did it justice. Next up, we have one from Kevin Shea, who writes, "Hey, Shat Crew. My name is Kevin Shea. I've been listening since season 7 of Game of Thrones and love the content. Unfortunately, this is my first time taking the time to email in. I wanted to mention Dr. Manhattan's humanity. Throughout the show, you've been mentioning how he doesn't really have humanity or even cares about the race. Please tell me if I'm wrong on this, but in preparation for the show, I read the novel, and this is not how I remember it. During his time on Mars, he did lose all care for humanity. He saw all the beauty in the universe and couldn't see how something so small as one species on one planet matters or is interesting at all. But after telling Laurie that it doesn't matter if humans kill themselves and wasn't going to comply with her pleas to save humanity, he watches her fall to her knees, weeping. This complicated reaction of crying over the death of millions of people she knew nothing about showed him a sign of humanity that was interesting. This is what caused him to come back for the climax of the novel. So, with all of that, it makes sense that he would be interested in discovering love. The emotions of humans, specifically love, is a perfectly reasonable thing for him to be interested in and motivated by. However, with Manhattan being who he is obviously incapable of falling in love, so isolating himself from his memory is the only way he could do it. P.S. I know you didn't want him in the show, but Manhattan coming back into the story makes sense since a lot of the things in the show were only possible through him. And he was shown in one of the trailers. So
I often compare myself to Dr. Manhattan, not in the way that I'm a superhero being or incredibly intelligent, but almost in my cold, hard feelings when it comes to love. I've been in love a few times in my life, but the first time I was ever in love, the first time I really felt love, and I think Dr. Manhattan's story kind of goes along with my experience. And when he meets Janie and he falls in love for the first time when he's still human, and when he goes back into that intrinsic field generator and becomes Dr. Manhattan, that's almost the same parallels of like when I was broken up for the first time and I was numb and I went through all this pain, and that love that I felt for someone was ripped away from me, almost like Dr. Manhattan's humanity. And since then, I've been in love a couple more times, but each time that's ripped away from you, you kind of lose a little bit of your humanity. And I wonder if I could stop my brain, if I could forget that I lost if I could forget that I was Roger Roper and be someone else for a little while, it'd be great to go back and experience love. So I kind of like his idea here.
I wish you could be someone else for a while. Do you also put rubber bands around your penis till it turns blue?
a cock ring is basically a rubber band, right?
Thanks, Raj.
And thank you, Kevin, for your email. Next up, we have one from Michael Peterson, also talking about our view of Dr. Manhattan. Michael says, I'm quite shocked that for all your guys' nerdiness, you continue to have such a shallow view of a TV show based on a comic book. From the beginning, Lindelof has been saying that this is a remix. Like how in one X-Men timeline, Magneto is the X-Men's biggest adversary, and in another, he's the leader of the school. A character being shown in a different light than when they are first introduced is not uncommon. It's actually quintessential comic book storytelling. So to say that Dr. Manhattan wouldn't fall in love, or that him giving everything up to be with Angela is unrealistic, is actually short-sighted of you. People change. Maybe the other two women weren't the love of his life, and Angela is. Either way, you have to wipe everything you think you know about these characters away and ingest this version of them that's being presented. This show is like when you ask two different people to tell you their version of the same event, and you're going to get two different stories. Somewhat similar, but with many variants and details. It doesn't make one right or wrong, or good or bad. It's just different angles at looking at characters from a familiar story in this case. And that comes from Michael Peterson.
You know, Michael, I would absolutely agree with you had we been given other information regarding Dr. Manhattan and how he existed in this world. When a person writes a story like this, I mean, they're starting, even though it's a remix, there's still an existing framework for who some of these characters are and what space they occupy in that world. I don't think anything that we ever say is carved in stone or anything. You know, we're all just sort of calling it as we see it. And these are just perceptions, which, you know, everyone's coming from a different angle, like you say.
Number one, we haven't been presented any other information beyond what we know of the graphic novel and what we know of maybe even the movie in terms of who Dr. Manhattan is. All the backstory aligns with what we've known of this character. So we have to assume there's that. And even if you were to use the example of Magneto in the X-Men comic books, they give reasons why Magneto is now a teacher, right? He goes through an evolution. In some versions, his mind is wiped and he forgets kind of who he is. And I feel like there's some parallels if you want to compare Magneto to Dr. Manhattan. What we've seen so far is his mind was wiped or it's trapped in that little carbon disc. Yeah. So while it's a remix is all the same beats and the familiar pattern of a song, just in a slight variation, but not too differently, or not too radical away from the original. And I think this episode or this series has been pretty close to the original, or at least inspired by, like, all the same beats are there. So I don't think it's that far off.
Thanks, Michael, for your letter. Next up, we have one from a repeat writer, Vasily, who writes in, I can't help but disagree that episode 7 was worse than 6. They are starkly different in the sense that 6 had one major reveal in the backstory of Old Man Will being Hooded Justice, whereas episode 7 had nearly 3 million reveals. To me, for a series that is only 9 episodes, why did we have to watch so much of Will Reeves' backstory? Yeah, it was cool and gave us a lot of information as to what Cyclops is and some insight into Hooded Justice's secrets, both race and sexuality. But as far as story progression for this series, does it even matter? I feel like they could have used the screen time more efficiently and thus not felt the need to cram so many storylines in episode 7. Which, yeah, it had a kitchen sink feel, but it at least starts to converge all the plot lines to what seems to be winding up to an amazing last 2 episodes. That being said, I don't see our days of flashbacks being over anytime soon. Sorry, you know there's going to be more backstory for Cal and Dr. Manhattan and how he met with Angela, plus probably something more on Lady Trieu's bringing up and parents, etc., etc. And that comes from Vasily.
I called it, right? There was going to be individuals that really liked episode 7. There's people who really didn't like episode 7. It was going to be a divisive episode. Listen, we're not here to tell you that you should hate this episode or anything like that. Like, listen, we're along for the ride with you. In terms of why episode 6 mattered so much, outside of it being, I think, well done beyond our expectations, is that ultimately the story is about legacy, and it's about, you know, how the sins of the past can influence the son. It's a biblical tale, right? It comes from, you know, we just watched Magnolia, And so I think it was Exodus 28.
You're the Catholic. I don't know.
Yeah, the sins of the father will be passed down to the sons. So we needed that exposition. Plus, yeah, it did explain that Hooded Justice was Hooded Justice, even though King B and I pretty much knew that from episode 1. But I didn't have as much problems with episode 7. I think my biggest worry is how are they going to wrap all this up in 2 remaining episodes?
Raj, I'm glad you brought up the point of not wanting people to dislike this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, like, life's too short to be I'm glad. I don't want you to not appreciate episode 7. I want you to love episode 7. But there are some people out there who maybe didn't love it, like Ash Schlafly. And there's other people who might not love it and they couldn't put their finger on why. And they're listening to this podcast and they're like, guys, what did you think of it? And for those of us who didn't think it was the pinnacle of Watchmen, then we're gonna vocalize what the issues were. Again, do I feel like I wasted an hour of my life? No. Am I going to go leave a message like people leave us on YouTube and say, I wish I'd never listened to this. I wish I'd never watched this. No. But the point being is that for some of us, it wasn't what we expected out of the show, especially after such a strong episode as episode 6.
YouTube is like the cantina in Star Wars. It's just full of the wretched scum and villainy.
See, I love it because it's like it's the most honest feedback. And one of the things that's best about it is there are people going back and forth with me where, like, they're actually rationalizing things where I'm like, okay, you're a total homer and you're trying to justify this show, but you've got a point there. Like, people saying, like, oh, maybe the reason why Laurie Blake didn't jump out of that chair faster is that what was occurring was so absurd that her brain couldn't even register what's going on here. Or people saying that maybe the 7th Cavalry, like, and Cyclops revealing their intent and, like, mapping out their plans is so goofy because it's trying to, make these guys look like bungling idiots to make them more palatable to the audience. Again, I don't agree with any of that stuff, but at least people are reasoning through it.
Well, we can agree that it was, in fact, so absurd.
All right, now on to some people who agreed with us. The first one comes from Calman from Minnesota, who says, hey, guys, I don't want to complain because I am enjoying the show, but there were a few things that just didn't jive with me this week. First, what's the deal with the Crookshanks and Phillipses all of a sudden acting like more than willing servants? Explaining these clone things is getting messy and seems to really contradict previous behavior. Second, Dr. Manhattan had lost interest in humanity. So what? He got bored creating new life and wanted to get laid, so he came back? It seems like they're taking Alan Moore's character backward. So far, Ozymandias' character has been spot on, but this doesn't feel like Dr. Manhattan behavior. Lastly, Ozymandias, the smartest man in the world, couldn't kill Dr. Manhattan. But we're supposed to believe that these inbred racists are going to pull it off by cobbling together old lithium batteries and steal his power? Just no. Alan Moore had it pretty well established Manhattan couldn't be killed, so I'll be pretty disappointed if they decide to change the character this way. I did enjoy the many times Angela asks, "What?" every time someone fed her some cryptic bullshit, making her seem clueless, when in the end she was hiding the biggest knowledge bomb of them all. So, how do you guys feel about the main show plot seemingly revolving around Dr. Manhattan as a key figure? Seems a little like they're living in the comic's shadow now. And that comes from Calman from Minnesota.
Well, I think it's important to note that just because the Kavalry has this plan to eliminate Dr. Manhattan, I don't think the story mandates that they be able to. I think the fact that they're going to attempt to and fail could create just as much danger for many, many people than if they were to succeed. So I think that the big impetus to stop them is to really just keep them from maybe setting off a giant dirty bomb in a city or some other event that, while they think it may achieve their goal, those who are in the know realize that they're just screwing up the neighborhood.
I don't think Ozymandias wanted to kill Dr. Manhattan in the original comic book storyline, did he?
Oh, he did.
Oh, he did.
Oh, yeah. You've got to think about it as an element of control. Ozymandias wants control, and Manhattan presents a variable that can't be controlled. You have to eliminate that variable. The best he could do was get him off the board temporarily.
Right. Okay. Now I'm remembering he sacrificed
Bubastis.
Bulbastis. Thank you. He did sacrifice Bulbastis once he lured Dr. Manhattan into that almost, it was a similar thing. It was like an intrinsic field generator, right?
He also gave a bunch of people cancer to make Dr. Manhattan feel real bad.
Right. But there were also other things that he did to kind of shield him from the plan, right? There were things that he put forth in motion. There were things, again, I'm still like book 4.
It's not that long a book. How much are you reading every night?
Well, I fall asleep after like 6 pages because that's how I go to sleep every night.
Someone should make a show out of it or a movie that you could watch.
Well, no. But there were things they go into more depth of what Ozymandias did to shield Dr. Manhattan from viewing the plan that Ozymandias was putting forth in place. And I forget what it is.
He had tachyon field so that Manhattan couldn't see what was going on. Yeah.
Tachyon generator. That's it. He had a yeah.
Next up, we have an email from Thiago who writes in, either Agent Blake is a really bad cop or the showrunners are telling us to our faces that women are usually dismissed as capable of being part of massive conspiracies. With all the information she had about Judd, it didn't even cross her mind that Jane Crawford was an accomplice. I refuse to believe that is bad writing.
Oh, I think she definitely knew something was up with it. That's why she goes and visits her. I think she knew that there was something amiss there. She wanted to see it for herself. And I think maybe there is some point to, I don't know, I forget the writer who wrote in, that maybe they were just so dumbfounded. She was so dumbfounded by her just coming out and admitting it that it kind of took her aback. Oh, the YouTube commenter said this. So yeah, maybe there is some logic to that, but I do believe that she knew that Jane was up to something and that's why she went and questioned her.
Yeah. What's funny about the explanation that Agent Blake was just dumbfounded by this woman just telling her what the whole plot was is it's like, it still doesn't explain why Jane Crawford would tell her the entire plot. Like, what criminal does that? Nobody does that. And if it's just hubris, if that's the explanation, I'm not buying it. Anyway, thanks for writing in, Thiago. Next, we have a great one coming in from Mech Theist, who says, great show, great analysis. Couple of things. Looking Glass was in the back seat of the car outside Angela's house when she bashed in Cal's skull. Check out the focus shift. Imagine if Topher walked in right then. Shit, he's already a little thrown off. Maybe his new blue daddy could help. Plus, on the PA at Trieu's complex, one announcement was that all green personnel needed to ensure they had no metal on them, like they were going into an MRI. Now, powerful electromagnetic signals, like for TVs, don't do that. So what is she broadcasting? And that comes from Mech Theist.
Did you guys catch that? Did you guys catch the focus shift that Looking Glass was in the backseat of the car outside Angela's house?
I went back and looked. I didn't see Looking Glass, but maybe I don't know. I don't have the best eyesight, I guess. But we did see 7th Cavalry, which could have been Looking Glass, right? In the mask.
Yeah, it's entirely possible that he's sitting back there, but I found that to be sort of secondary to Looking Glass is there. They're watching her. I mean, there's a reason they're watching her. So you've got to wonder what they know about her situation. Whether or not Looking Glass is there, I'm happy to let that be a surprise.
Well, and then in terms of the complex, we know that they have giant electromagnetic drones. Maybe they don't want metal in your pockets, so you'll be scooped up by one of those drones that they're about to release, or it could be something else like a broadcast. So I don't know.
Thanks for your letter, Mech Theist. Next up, we have another one about Lady Trieu, and that comes from Cody O'Brien. This one's a theory. He says, I think Lady Trieu is the actual villain of the story. I think that she has a personal vendetta against Dr. Manhattan, and she is actually working with Cyclops to kill him. It would make sense that she'd have beef with him considering she's from Vietnam. Maybe her mom was killed during the war, and that's why those memories are so important to Trieu. Also, Cyclops was definitely using her tech in the latest episode when Keen was telling his plan to Laurie. I also think it's interesting that the correct pronunciation of Trieu is more like Trieu, but she definitely pronounces it as true. Maybe there's some symbolism there with a fixation on truth. So far, pretty much every major character has more to their story than it seems at first, and her being the villain would check that box for her. And that comes from Cody.
Yeah, Cody, I've never really cared for this character. There's just something about her that's a little too hip, a little too cool and in the know, and I don't trust the rich. So, but that's just my own personal prejudice.
We know that Bien Mai, Lady Trieu's mother, was a victim of the comedian commandos that went through the village and destroyed them. And there's rumors in the PDpedia and articles that she could be funding the VLF. So it would make sense to me, if they're going to do another pull the rug out from under the audience, that ultimately she's in episode 7 telling us that she's the hero, when in all actuality she's the villain and is the one funding. Like you said, with the technology, she's funding the 7th Cavalry and is part of Cyclops. Or they could be two competing villains going against each other. So I definitely do believe that she has more reason to hate Dr. Manhattan than to love Dr. Manhattan. I think that the wild card in all of this, though, is Ozymandias. I know in the deep dive, you guys suggested what would happen if Ozymandias was even not part of everything. It was just kind of a ruse and a red herring and all this. But there has to be something. There has to be some reason.
And speaking of Ozymandias, we had a great late email. It was like the last one that got in under the wire from listener John Lish, one of King B's favorites. John says, "Hi, guys. I was amused to hear the suggestion that my middle name should begin with D. It would be a fine name. My substantive point of this email is pondering the days experienced by Adrian Veidt on Europa. There was a suggestion I heard from Lindelof that time isn't working the same way on the HBO podcast. I have a suspicion that the writer's room may be using Jupiter itself to determine days rather than Europa, as that moon doesn't rotate as it completes an orbit of the planet every 85 hours. Jupiter itself takes 12 years to orbit the sun. Neither of those are particularly useful in fitting with our story. However, Jupiter takes about 10 hours to complete a rotation. So a day on Jupiter is 10 hours. If the Europa bubble is reflecting that pattern while using 365 days to equal a year, then 6 days on Europa would be the equivalent of around 2.5 years on Earth. That would mean that it would be 2014 or early 2015 when we see Adrian Veidt's trial completed. That gives enough time for Veidt to travel from Europa to Earth, crash in the Clark's farmland, and be picked up by Lady Trieu. If it was Veidt that crash landed, that is. It's an ugly logic, in my opinion, and doesn't please my sense of how time should work on Europa, but it's the only way I can fit Veidt returning to Earth is having 10-hour days. The alternative explanation for the Lindelof comment is that the Veidt storyline is completely contained on Europa, and he doesn't interact with the main story. I can't see that pleasing a lot of fans, and it's difficult to see how that pays off thematically. This has been niggling me for a while, and I'm looking forward to see how they answer this question. Regards, John Delish."
I'm just glad someone else did the math for us on this one and did the research. We sometimes get our wipe scores wrong, and we only have to add 3 numbers and divide by 3, and we sometimes get that wrong. So thanks, John. I think the only question that needs to be explained is, how is he going to get back? I think this is the biggest, is it, he certainly can't fly back on one of those Voyager class satellites. I mean, that just doesn't make sense. How, and you can't be propelled through space by a trebuchet using the technology that he has. I mean, outside of his own teleportation device, how's he going to get back?
If you're on a planet without an atmosphere, couldn't you possibly escape its orbit from a trebuchet?
We just saw a guy get his head hammered in, and there was another guy inside of there. So let's not talk about what's realistic anymore. Also, I don't know if you guys forgot that Will Reeves can control people's minds with a flashlight.
You guys never did that to your neighborhood friends late at night? Just shine a flashlight in their eyes and control their minds?
Thanks, John, for your letter and your math skills. Next up, we have one from Matt, who says, "Hi, guys. 2 thoughts after watching episode 7. First, I think the use of an elephant for nostalgia treatment was very purposeful. We have always been told, quote, an elephant never forgets, end quote. It seems an odd paradox to treat someone with cerebral fluid from an animal that never forgets to allow that person to forget their memories. Second, I've been thinking more about the warning, beware of the Cyclops, and the general talk of Cyclops. In the movie and graphic novel, Dr. Manhattan has a marking on his forehead, one filled in small circle and a large circle around it. I don't believe there's an explanation in the movie or the novel about this marking. However, it now strikes me that this could look like an eyeball or a Cyclops. I'm not sure how much merit there is to that theory, seeing as how Will Reeves / Hooded Justice was warned about Cyclops before Dr. Manhattan was ever created. However, if Dr. Manhattan does not experience time like we do, I suppose anything would be possible. I very much enjoy the show and hope to hear you discuss this on the newsstand. Matt.
Hey, Matt, thanks for writing in. Just a heads up that he actually does discuss it, I believe, in the movie and in the novel. Dr. Manhattan shows up to a press conference, I think with one or two other heroes, and they ask him, "Where's your mask?" And he states that masks to him are meaningless. He has no other identity besides who he is. But if we as humanity have to have a symbol to represent him, he would prefer it be something that carries meaning. I believe it's a model for a hydrogen atom that he sort of burns into his head and, says, let this go ahead and be the icon that you need to glom onto.
Yeah, I really liked this email, and I thought maybe there was something going on with it. But then I looked at the timeline, like King B just outlined there, and it wouldn't make sense that they're imitating the Dr. Manhattan symbol as the symbol of the Cyclops. Some people have suggested, well, maybe it's the eye of the squid, because the squid kind of looks like. But again, that wouldn't make sense because that happened years after Cyclops supposedly existed, which was as far back as maybe even the 20s or the 30s. So. Yeah, good. It's a fun email. It's fun to discuss, but I don't believe that the Cyclops symbol has anything to do with Dr. Manhattan.
I don't believe it.
Elephant in the room.
I mean, it's clear that this notion of like that third eye, or with the Cyclops or the singular squid, these were all elements that were attempting mass control. Yeah. So there is some sort of like universal thought process that's being promoted through this imagery of a singular eye. And it could be argued that hydrogen atom is also a new thought process introduced into, the world psyche of there are gods among us. I mean, they're not wrong in the symbolism. I just don't think the application is there.
Look at you, King B. That's absolutely fantastic. That's awesome. I agree with that.
Also looks like a boob. Thanks, Matt.
Boom.
Next up, we have one from Jim Casper, who writes in, there are some wild cards with traumatic pasts whose actions are unpredictable. So he's writing in response to our deep dive where we kind of laid out who could be on either side of a battle if there were supposed to be battle lines drawn. So all the characters he's listing off are people who he still considers wild cards that can go either way. So one is Laurie Blake. He says, I just keep going back to her in the Manhattan confessional and her joke. Maybe she is the one to knock them all down. How is she going to react when she finds out that Manhattan has been living inside Cal and having closet sex with Sister Night all these years when he left her with nothing but a big blue dildo? That will be ugly. A scorned masked hero with an agenda and a bad attitude. Number 2 is Looking Glass. His whole existence of fear and anxiety was based on a fraud. He can't be happy with anybody at this point, knowing everything that he knows. He obviously has some skills that will be unleashed at some point. And number 3 is Sister Night and Dr. Manhattan. I have no idea where they come out, but it does not appear that Sister Night wants any part of either side. Manhattan's history suggests he wants no part of anything either. I don't know how this plays out, but I don't think there's a hero here. 2 bad sides vying for power and 3 wild cards whose actions have been shaped by traumatic experience. And that comes from Jim Casper.
Well, first things first, Dr. Manhattan isn't the one that gave her the blue dildo. That was Night Owl 2. That was Dan Dryberg as kind of a fuck you. You've never gotten over your past. So here's a symbolism of that and what you've done to me.
I mean, he did leave her with the hunger.
It would make sense that Laurie Blake is the wild card here because of those scenes that she's having in the jokes and kind of like the symbolism that went into the episode. It was episode 3, right? Where she was telling this joke and she's the one to bring it all down. But one could argue, though, that she was just telling the story of what she did in the original storyline when she kind of is the one that was able to bring Dr. Manhattan back that ultimately led to Ozymandias being able to move through with his plan. So I don't know.
Well, I think Jim does a really great job of reminding us that we're kind of looking at this thing, or we tend to start looking at this thing very comic booky and sort of a black and white, good guy, bad guy side. That's not really entirely true. Everyone here is pursuing their version of what they think best is. And just because they butt up against each other doesn't make any one of them specifically the bad guy, except for the racists. But, there's a lot of gray area here. And I think everyone's they're all wild cards.
Yeah, and I want to clarify that I don't think anyone on the podcast, anyone from the Shat crew, actually subscribes to an idea of one side versus another. This was kind of an idea that was presented by several listeners who asked, how are people going to line up? We wanted to address it because prior to episode 7, it didn't seem like that was going to happen. Episode 7 kind of introduced the idea that you had sort of these associations of characters that were really, at least, if not in cahoots, they were at least forming like truces. And that makes sense. If you look at other stuff that Lindelof has done, like Lost, like The Leftovers, people jump sides all the time and you never quite know where anyone sits. Next up, we have our final email, and that comes from Carmelita from California, a longtime listener and contributor. We love you, Carmelita. She writes in, gentlemen, this wasn't my favorite episode of the series, but I did come away feeling positive about it, and I was lost in thought for about 20 minutes afterward. Here's where my mind went. Keen's hints to Laurie Blake and Trieu's summary of the 7th Cavalry's big plan got me thinking about Friedrich Nietzsche's Übermensch. If Nietzsche's intent was to promote a philosophy of transcending the value society places on otherworldliness to embrace and affirm our earthly life, that was lost on the Nazis, who embraced the Übermensch to prop up their belief in a biologically superior master race. It's interesting to examine the 7th Cavalry's justification for the plan, to become like Dr. Manhattan to restore balance to the world. But nothing about Dr. Manhattan's abilities or presence suggests balance. He's inherently disproportionate to the rest of humanity. The 7th Cavalry's reasoning reminds me of cries for an International Men's Day or a White History Month, the idea ultimately amounting to some people of privilege wanting more recognition to, quote, keep things fair, when it's actually a means to counter societal shifts that challenge their privilege. In the final reveal of the episode, we have confirmation that Dr. Manhattan has been hiding in the life of a happily married man and father on Earth, just another member of humanity. The 7th Cavalry might see Dr. Manhattan as being a biologically superior Übermensch, but I wonder if Nietzsche would consider Manhattan's embrace of worldliness and the humanness of humanity to be the truer embodiment of the philosophy. Your friend, Carmelita from California.
So all I know of Nietzsche, am I saying that right? Nietzsche? I always get that wrong.
I said it 2 different ways just in reading this. So in my head,
yeah,
it's Nietzsche.
Yeah.
But then when I say it around people who read books, I say Nietzsche.
I think the one thing I do know about him, though, is throughout history, everyone's got his writings wrong, or the way that they've deployed his methodology. It's like Ayn Rand's, right? And Ayn Rand was a hack anyway, but everyone always gets her messaging wrong. So it would make sense to me that the 7th Cavalry would be a big fan of Nietzsche, and his Übermensch. If Carmelita is comparing and saying that 7th Cavalry is getting it wrong by wanting to create their own Dr. Manhattan, of course. But throughout comic books and throughout these types of stories, they're always trying to bring balance to the force, if you will, right? People have theorized that the reason that Obi-Wan wanted to teach Luke how to be a Jedi Knight was to counterbalance Darth Vader, right? And the reason that there were 2 Jedis, Leia and Luke, is because in order for there to be balance in the Force, there has to be 2 Siths, which is the Emperor and Darth Vader. And when one of those are killed, that brings imbalance to the Force. So listen, I'm not smart enough, nor have I ever read Nietzsche, but I did watch all the Star Wars movies, so that's the only thing that I have to do. That's the only thing I have to compare it to. But what I'm saying here is it all continuously goes wrong, and you get the prequels and Jar Jar Binks and pod racing.
Good. But I think what Carmelita is saying here, and I tend to agree after reading this, is basically the idea that Nietzsche's entire message was, look, stop thinking about the other world, stop thinking about the spiritual, the afterlife, all that shit, and focus on humanness, focus on your earthly life. And the Nazis misinterpreted that as lending credence to the idea of essentially a biologically superior master race. And what she's saying essentially here is the 7th Cavalry is thinking of the greatest thing to be is a Dr. Manhattan, when in fact Dr. Manhattan has realized the greatest thing to be is just a guy.
Being a guy is pretty cool.
Thanks, Carmelita, for your email. Next time, we're moving on to the voicemail, and we have 3 this week. The first one comes from listener Kyle.
Hey, guys. This is Kyle from New Jersey. Long-time listener, first-time caller. Love the show. Have loved all of your shows, going back to Westworld and really many, many things in between. I just wanted to take a second to say that I'm fairly certain that Ozymandias' note on Europa is going to say, "Help me, daughter," or "Save me, daughter," or something like that. And it's going to be for Trieu, and she's going to send some sort of pod back to save his old ass and bring him back to the earth. All right, guys, thanks a lot. Appreciate you working every day on this for us. So I really appreciate all your efforts. Have a good one. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Yeah, Kyle, I mean, it could be daughter. That makes sense. That would tie into the true theory. I mean, if I had to pick him being related to someone, that's what I would hope for.
Gene, you saw a similar tweet like this, and I think your response was, that's a lot of bodies.
Remember how much time he's got out there. He's on a very limited schedule with that spacesuit, and he gets pulled back in. So it might just be help me, D.
Big D? Big D's going to help Ozymandias?
Thanks, Kyle, for your voicemail. Next one comes from Shakira.
Hey guys, this is Shakira calling from Atlanta to talk about Watchmen episode 6, This Extraordinary Being. And I've been listening to your podcast. I love it. And I wanted to just bring up something that stood out for me with episode 6, and that's the importance of June, and the name June. So the Tulsa massacre actually began on May 31st. And I believe that's the date that Will and June escaped with June's parents. And the massacre actually ended on June 1st. And so I thought that, she really represented the future and hopes for the future, whereas a lot of the show focuses on legacy in the past. I think whether her parents gave her that name when she was born, she represented the future. If Will gave her that name after her parents were deceased, then I think she represented his hopes for the future. The fact that she was cloaked in an American flag, I think, shows his hopes for the future in America. And as those hopes started to deteriorate after he joined the Minutemen and Captain Metropolis, and they sort of let him down, and he continued to be let down by these institutions that he really valued. I believe that's sort of when his relationship with June really deteriorated. So anyway, keep up the great work. I am a loyal listener, and I hope you guys have a wonderful Thanksgiving. Take care. Bye.
That might be the single most sweetest voicemail we've ever received.
I got a marriage proposal about 30 minutes ago. I don't know if you caught that.
That was an email. I'm talking about like a voicemail. Like that. Shakira had a very sweet voice. She seemed very thoughtful and very sincere when she said she listens to the podcast and she really likes it. And she just had a really beautiful tone about it. I really like this idea though, Gene. I really like, I assume that he didn't know who June was when he picked her up as a baby. And so I tend to lean on the side of maybe he named her after the month in which he found her, which was June. And maybe she did represent the future and the idea, at least of hope, because when we see older June was almost like that grounded hope for Will as he's going through the trials and tribulations of being a cop in a racist precinct, trying to be that mass vigilante. She's trying to imbue upon him that, listen, you need to get yourself right. You got a lot of anger in yourself and, you need to get yourself right. And I thought by doing this, you would get what ails you in the past, but I see it's making you worse. And then she's also that hope for Sister Night as a young child and escaping her orphanage that she's placed in. So I really like this idea that June really did represent that hope of humanity, and her name derived from the month that she was discovered by a young Will Reeves.
Yeah, Raj, the idea of like this tiny Will Reeves after seeing all that he saw and cradling this baby and deciding that he doesn't know much. He's still a kid and he just maybe names her after the month that it is, right? June. And then her growing up to father his child and start this legacy. I mean, it's a beautiful bit of writing, Shakira, even if it's not what the writers of the show intended. I love this idea. Also important to note that June is the month that Juneteenth falls in, which is June 19th, and that marks the abolition of slavery in Texas. So that is kind of a marking of freedom as well, and particularly of particular significance to African Americans. Thanks, Shakira, for your voicemail. And finally, we have one from Daniel from Florida.
Hey guys, Daniel from Florida, big fan, really appreciate the podcast. I was wondering if you guys could speak more about the Lindelof-Mason podcast and just your thoughts about what they've talked about recently. And then just a theory that I've heard, don't want to take credit for it, but is there a possibility that Lady Trieu is actually working with Reeves to somehow hypnotize the whole city? And that's what that big tower is for? Just wondering. Thanks for it. Appreciate it.
Yeah, Daniel, I can't think of another explanation for what the Millennium Clock would do other than the stated purpose of telling time. And I also can't think of any reason that Lady Trieu would have Will Reeves around. Like, she doesn't need him as like a henchman. She's got all the money in the world. She doesn't need him for that. So is it this technology that he can wield? Is that the reason why he's around? And then again, remember, we haven't seen him in like 2 episodes. So what's he up to?
As to the Lindelof podcast, I would never want to be accused of stealing ideas, especially when we're running a little bit behind. So I personally don't listen to it. I don't browse the Reddit forums. I try to just bring my own personal experience and thoughts to the pod with the most minimal amount of research I can do and still sound like I walk upright.
I've been accused of browsing the subreddit before, but I don't. I'm a big fan of Reddit, but I purposefully avoid Watchmen Reddits. Just like when we're doing Westworld, I avoid that because I don't want to be, like King B said, accused of stealing another person's thoughts. I don't listen to the official podcast because I don't have time to do that, nor do I want their ideas to imbue into ours. Gene, I know you've listened to a couple of episodes, at least, of
religiously.
Do they go into that, the Watchtower?
There's only 3 episodes of this podcast. So the first one covers episodes 1, 2, and 3. The second one covers 4, 5, and 6. And the final one will cover 7, 8, and 9. But it only comes out after all those episodes have aired.
Got it.
So the next one will come out after the finale. So it doesn't really give anything away. All it is Lindelof reflecting back to what has already happened to explain the kind of the thinking behind it. I find it really enjoyable, actually. I thought I would hate it because of the fact that you've got, like how bad you have to be at storytelling to need another place to tell them what your story meant. But in this case, it's a lot of like what happened in the writer's room. And you find out things like the fact that they have a lot of women in the writer's room, which is, very uncommon for most TV, or, the ideas behind their inspiration for things, right? So Lindelof like flat out says, this show is about a reckoning. This show is about legacy. This show is about race. And you remember early on in the series, I was like, maybe 7th Cavalry aren't racists. Maybe no, they are. They're racist. Yeah. And that's part of it.
It would make sense to me that she's using the clock tower for something more. And I know Lindelof, I think you said
Millennium Clock.
I confused it there with Back to the Future, right? The clock tower. You got to get the DeLorean up to 88 miles an hour. But no, I think she is using the Millennium Clock for something different. That would make sense. We talked about this in responses to some other emails. I just like the fact that people from Florida are listening to us. Go Florida.
One other thing before we close out, I have an actually that I was hoping somebody would write in about, but I'm just going to execute it on myself because nobody did. During the deep dive, I mentioned that Angela Abar and Cal Abar had been together for 30 years. King B questioned me on that, and I was like, no, absolutely, they have. Wrong. I was wrong on that. So actually, they've only been together since 2009. So they met fairly recently. They've only been together for about a decade, which means that the interaction conceivably between Dr. Manhattan, if it was all just one fell swoop, Cal Abar's creation coincided with Dr. Manhattan meeting Angela Abar. That's only been in the last 10 years. So he could have very much been gone for a very long time and then come back. It's not like they got together in 89.
Yeah.
Well, there you go.
There it is.
All right. And with that concludes this week's episode of Shat on TV Watchmen Newsstand. Be sure to follow us on social media and share with a friend. We're on Twitter, Snapchat, and Instagram at Shat on TV. On Facebook, just search for Shat on TV Podcasts. The website is shatontv.com. You can email us with your ideas at hosts@shatontv.com. And if you would like to send us a voicemail, it's 914-719-SHAT. We're everywhere fine podcasts can be found, including iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Pandora, Spotify, and YouTube. Be sure to subscribe. And if you stop by iTunes, please leave a review. That helps the podcast grow. I think we got about 6 or 7 new ones this week. Most of them were friendly. One was not, but it was at least entertaining.
Listen, I on the way back, I was listening to our podcast, and we are the 3rd most rated Watchmen podcast on iTunes.
Damn.
The official one obviously is the number one, Bald Move, which we like and enjoy and support independent podcasting. They're number two, but they're using an old feed. They're using like their old, what's the other Lindelof series? Leftovers.
Yeah.
They're using that same old feed. So I think a lot of their numbers is still from like their leftovers 3 years of reviews. So I think we have with over 300 reviews for our podcast. This is the best rated show review podcast that we've done. It eclipses, I think Game of Thrones and Westworld have more reviews, but in terms of reviews over 300, we've got a lot of positivity for this. And I think that it goes everything to do with King B being so knowledgeable on the books. And Gene, you're producing this. So hats off to both of you guys for the job well done for this season. It's been a lot of fun. I'm bummed that we only have 2 more episodes.
All right. Well, on behalf of my co-hosts, the King Bee and Roger Roper, I'm Gene Lyons. Be sure to join us on Sunday night for our Shat on TV Watchmen Instacast for episode 8. A god walks into a bar.
Aha! I get it.